Welcome to our show. Today, we're diving into a fascinating piece of history that combines rocket science, prison life, and the tumultuous events of World War II. Our guest is an expert on Soviet and German rocket development during this period. Can you start by telling us about Sergei Korolev and his experience during the Great Purge?
Absolutely. It's quite a story. Sergei Korolev was a brilliant Soviet rocket engineer who, unfortunately, fell victim to false accusations during the Great Purge. He wasn't alone in this fate. Many other talented individuals were unjustly accused and imprisoned during this time, including Valentin Glushko, the designer of the Soviet Union's first liquid-fueled rocket engine.
That sounds terrible. What exactly happened between Korolev and Glushko?
Well, it's a bit of a sad tale. Glushko, under pressure, falsely implicated Korolev, despite the latter having spoken favorably of him in the past. This incident created a rift between the two men that would later impact the Soviet Union's moon landing program. It's a prime example of how the Soviet system, known for its ability to concentrate resources on major projects, ironically suffered from internal conflicts in this crucial area, squandering valuable opportunities.
Wow, that's quite a twist. So what happened to Korolev after he was accused?
Korolev was initially sentenced to labor in the Kolyma mines in the Far East. However, his transfer was delayed due to a leadership change in the NKVD, the Soviet secret police. When Lavrenti Beria took over, and despite his notorious reputation, he proved to be an effective manager of military production. One of Beria's first actions was to recall Korolev at the request of Andrei Tupolev, who was Korolev's mentor.
That's interesting. So did Korolev avoid the harsh labor camp entirely?
Not exactly. By the time Beria inquired about Korolev, he had already been sent to the Far East. You have to understand the vast expanse of Russia meant that reaching some remote areas could take up to 2 weeks by train along the Trans-Siberian Railway. It's possible that Korolev took a shortcut via the Chinese Eastern Railway, passing through Manchuria and re-entering Russia near Suifenhe.
That sounds like quite a journey. Where did Korolev end up?
In August 1939, Korolev arrived at a brutal labor camp near the northern tip of the Sea of Okhotsk, close to the Kamchatka Peninsula. The conditions were terrible. He developed scurvy due to poor nutrition, likely from a lack of vegetables and vitamin C in the frigid climate. To make matters worse, severely beaten, even losing some teeth. This happened in November, with the harsh winter still ahead.
That sounds absolutely horrific. How did he manage to survive?
It was a close call, actually. Just when things seemed dire, orders from above finally reached the camp for Korolev's return to Moscow. But here's where it gets even more dramatic. He was supposed to board a ship to Vladivostok, but that ship ended up getting lost in heavy fog and sinking near Japan after hitting a reef. Almost all the prisoners on board perished. Korolev missed this ill-fated voyage by sheer luck.
That's incredible. Talk about a twist of fate. So what happened next?
Korolev ended up stranded at the port of Magadan for the entire winter. The Sea of Okhotsk is frozen for 280 days a year, and even when the ice melts, dense fog often blankets the area. He survived by taking odd jobs, including repairing shoes. Eventually, he made it to Vladivostok, then to Khabarovsk, where he received medical treatment and recuperated.
And after all that, he was sent back to Moscow?
That's right. Once he recovered, he was sent back to Moscow with a new 8-year prison sentence. But this time, things were very different.
Different how?
Well, instead of a harsh labor camp, Korolev found himself in what looked like a factory surrounded by barbed wire. In the cafeteria, he was surprised to see his former boss, Tupolev, along with other renowned aircraft designers like Myasishchev and Petlyakov. It turned out to be a prison-based design bureau where many of the Soviet Union's top aviation experts were imprisoned together.
That's fascinating. So the Soviets were putting their imprisoned experts to work?
Exactly. Stalin recognized the value of these brilliant minds and wanted to keep them working even while imprisoned. As Stalin reportedly said, "This man will save the Soviet Union in the future," a statement that would prove prophetic. They were tasked with designing a light bomber called the 222, which had impressive specifications: a range of 2,000 kilometers, a maximum takeoff weight of over 10 tons, a speed of 520 kilometers per hour, and the ability to carry 3 tons of bombs.
That's quite a project for imprisoned engineers. How did the Tu-2 perform?
The Tu-2 made its first flight in 1941 and proved its worth during the Great Patriotic War. It was so successful that China purchased 33 of these aircraft in 1949, which later saw action in the Korean War and the liberation of Yijingshan Islands. This latter operation marked the first coordinated land, sea, and air campaign by the People's Liberation Army, with the Tu-2 playing a crucial role.
It's amazing how they went from harsh labor camps to designing successful aircraft. What happened to Tupolev after this success?
Tupolev, as the chief designer, received much credit for the Tu-2's success. He was eventually released from prison, had his honors restored, and even received an unprecedented apology from Stalin himself. However, other designers remained in prison, continuing their work in relatively comfortable conditions. Their workspaces resembled normal offices, but they were required to return to guarded barracks at night, separated from their families.
Were there other such facilities?
Yes, the NKVD operated several of these prison-based design bureaus. For example, Glushko led a rocket research group in Kazan, focusing on liquid fuel rocket engines. Korolev actually requested a transfer to work with Glushko, setting aside their personal differences in favor of his passion for rocketry.
Interesting. Now, all of this was happening during World War II, right? How did the war impact these operations?
The war had a huge impact. As the war situation intensified, many Soviet institutions were relocated inland. Tupolev was moved to Omsk, while Glushko went to Kazan. The Great Patriotic War began on June 22, 1941, with German forces advancing rapidly towards Moscow, forcing the evacuation of many organizations. Embassies were moved to Kuybyshev, now Samara, on the Volga River. Even Lenin's body was evacuated from his mausoleum. Stalin, however, remained in Moscow throughout this period.
That must have been a chaotic time. How long did this relocation last?
It wasn't until 1942, when the Soviets successfully defended Moscow against the German advance, that many institutions began to return. This back-and-forth relocation happened several times during the war. Despite their setback at Moscow, the Germans were still largely on the offensive and held the initiative in the war.
Speaking of the Germans, I understand they were also working on rocket technology during this period?
Absolutely. The Germans, led by Wernher von Braun, were making significant strides in rocket development. They faced a constant threat from the United Kingdom, particularly from British heavy bombers. Germany's radar systems were inadequate for early warning, often detecting British bombers only when they were already deep in German territory.
How did the Germans respond to this threat?
They needed a fast, agile interceptor aircraft to counter these high-flying bombers. Recognizing that piston engines couldn't provide the required climb rate, German engineers turned to newly developed rocket engines. This eventually resulted in the creation of the Me-163 rocket-powered interceptor, although it had significant limitations, including extremely short range.
Interesting. Where were the Germans doing this rocket development work?
They established a massive testing facility at Peenemünde on an island near the Baltic Sea. It's quite an interesting story how they found this location. Von Braun was struggling to find a suitable, undisturbed testing site with enough space for increasingly long-range rockets. During Christmas of 1935, his mother mentioned that his father had once gone duck hunting near Peenemünde. After visiting the island, von Braun found it to be an ideal location for rocket testing.
That's quite a coincidence. What kind of facility did they build there?
The German government invested 11 million marks to construct an elaborate testing facility at Peenemünde. This complex included engine and rocket test stands, a fuel factory for producing liquid oxygen and alcohol, a supersonic wind tunnel for aircraft testing, cruise missile launch pads, and rocket assembly buildings. Interestingly, a prisoner of war camp was also established nearby, with inmates used for labor-intensive tasks.
Wow, that sounds like a massive operation. Can you tell us more about the rockets they developed there?
Certainly. Von Braun, who was a true genius, began leading rocket development at just 22 years old. His first project, the A-1 rocket, was essentially a large toy weighing only 150 kilograms with a diameter of 30 centimeters and a length of 1.4 meters. Unfortunately, it exploded shortly after launch.
Not a great start. Did they improve from there?
They did indeed. The improved A2 rocket performed much better, with 2 test rockets reaching heights of 2.2 kilometers and 3.5 kilometers respectively. The A2 incorporated a gyroscope for stability control, making it more reliable than its predecessor. Then in 1936, von Braun began work on the A3 rocket, which was designed to include an inertial navigation system. This advancement would transform the rocket into a guided missile.
That sounds like a significant leap forward. How did the A3 perform?
Unfortunately, the A3 rocket tests were unsuccessful. Von Braun concluded that the inertial navigation system was likely not mature enough. This led to the development of the A5 rocket, essentially a scaled-down version of the future A4 rocket. The A5 could reach an altitude of 12 kilometers, had a launch weight of 900 kilograms, measured 5.8 meters in length, and had a diameter of 80 centimeters.
It seems like they were making steady progress. What came after the A5?
The next step was the A4 rocket, which was a significant leap forward in rocket technology. It was designed to deliver a 1-ton high-explosive payload to a target 250 kilometers away, doubling the range of the Paris gun from World War I. The A4's engine needed to produce an impressive 25 tons of thrust, a massive increase from the previous maximum of just 1 ton.
That sounds incredibly ambitious. What kind of challenges did they face in developing the A4?
They faced numerous technical challenges. One of the primary issues was the inability of existing metals to withstand the extreme temperatures generated by the rocket engine, which reached 2,700 to 2,900 degrees Celsius. Cooling the engine became a critical problem. Engineer Thiel, responsible for the engine design, devised an innovative solution. Instead of using a traditional water cooling system, he created a design where the fuel, alcohol, flowed through channels in the engine's walls.
That's quite ingenious. Were there other innovations in the A4 design?
Absolutely. Another significant challenge was the fuel pump. The A4's engine required 125 kilograms of fuel to be delivered to the combustion chamber every second. They ended up using a small engine to drive the fuel pump, making the A4 a direct ancestor of modern rockets. The A4 also used hydrogen peroxide catalytic decomposition to power its turbopump, which was a novel approach at the time.
It sounds like they were really pushing the boundaries of technology. How did they handle the issue of stability for such a large rocket?
That's a great question. Given the A4's large size and long-range capabilities, it needed to withstand strong winds during flight to maintain its trajectory. As the rocket burns through its fuel, its center of gravity shifts, presenting another challenge for maintaining stability. This is similar to balancing a stick on your fingertip. It requires constant dynamic adjustments. To maintain stability, the rocket needs to constantly sense its attitude and position. This is where gyroscopes come into play. These devices are essential for automatic control systems, providing crucial information about the rocket's orientation and movement. The rocket also used jet vanes, small blade-like structures inserted into the hot exhaust gases, to control its attitude.
Fascinating. So after all this development, how did the A4 perform in tests?
It wasn't until June 1942 that von Braun was ready to test the A4 rocket. The first 2 launches failed, but the third was a success, reaching an altitude of 83 kilometers and a range of 193 kilometers. However, consistency was an issue. Out of many A4 rockets launched, only a few achieved these results. Most experienced failures, either crashing shortly after takeoff or failing to reach the desired range and altitude. It took until 1943, after continuous improvements, for the rocket to become more reliable.
It sounds like they were making progress just as the war was turning against Germany. How did this affect the rocket program?
You're right, by 1943, Germany's position in the war had changed dramatically. From July 1942 to February 1943, while von Braun was testing the A4 rocket, the Battle of Stalingrad was raging. This battle marked a turning point on the Eastern Front, with Germany losing the initiative in the war. On the Western Front, things weren't going well for Germany either. The British Royal Air Force conducted 26 large-scale bombing raids on the Ruhr industrial area. The Germans were particularly concerned about potential attacks on the dams in this region.
Did the British actually attack these dams?
They did, and it's quite an incredible story. The British created specialized cylindrical bombs that could be attached to the underside of Lancaster heavy bombers. These bombs were designed to spin rapidly before being released at extremely low altitudes over the reservoirs. They would skip across the surface, jumping over the anti-torpedo nets, and eventually collide with the dam walls. In a single night, 3 dams in the Ruhr area were destroyed, causing massive flooding. The aftermath was catastrophic, with over 1,600 people losing their lives. Tragically, while about 600 of the victims were German civilians, the majority were Soviet prisoners of war.
That's devastating. How did Hitler respond to these setbacks?
As the war situation deteriorated, Hitler became increasingly desperate. He pinned his hopes on 3 new weapons: the A-4 rocket, which would become the V-2, the Messerschmitt 262 jet fighter, and the Phi-103, the V-1 flying bomb. Each of these would go on to have a significant impact on future military technology. In his desperation, Hitler summoned Dornberger, the head of rocket development, and asked if the rockets could carry a 10-ton payload to strike enemy targets. Dornberger was shocked by this unrealistic demand, as the A-4 rocket could only carry about 1 ton at the time. Hitler's furious reaction to this news highlighted his increasingly unstable state of mind.
It sounds like the German rocket program was under immense pressure. What happened to it in the end?
Well, despite Hitler's demands, progress on these weapons was severely hampered when Peenemünde, the secret weapons development site, suffered a massive bombing raid. This attack brought production to a halt and raised questions about how the British had discovered the location of this top-secret facility. It was a significant setback for the German rocket program and effectively marked the beginning of the end for their advanced weapons projects.
Wow, what an incredible story. From Soviet prison camps to German rocket facilities, it really shows how the war drove technological development in unexpected ways. Thank you so much for sharing all this fascinating information with us today.
It's been my pleasure. You're right. It's a complex and fascinating period of history that shows how adversity and conflict can sometimes drive incredible technological advancements. It's also a stark reminder of the human cost of war and the ethical dilemmas posed by the development of such powerful weapons. Thank you for having me on the show.
And thank you for providing such detailed insights. I'm sure our listeners have learned a lot about this crucial period in the history of rocketry and warfare. It's amazing to think how these developments, born out of conflict, eventually led to space exploration and many of the technologies we use today. Do you have any final thoughts on the legacy of these wartime rocket programs?
Absolutely. While the immediate context of these developments was warfare, the long-term impact has been immense. The work done by both Soviet and German engineers during this period laid the groundwork for the space race, satellite technology, and even aspects of modern computing. It's a powerful reminder that scientific progress often comes from unexpected places, and that even in the darkest times, human ingenuity can lead to remarkable advancements. However, it also underscores the importance of directing such brilliance towards peaceful ends rather than destructive ones.
That's a great point to end on. Thank you once again for joining us today and sharing your expertise. To our listeners, thank you for tuning in to this fascinating exploration of the history of rocketry during World War II. Until next time.